Yes, perfect. So I think also, Tatiana, if you can help me out and start recording this session. And for everyone asking in the messages, if you can keep your camera off. Of course, although later when we have the dialogue, we're always really excited for people to turn their camera on if they can, if they're able to, if they have a strong enough Wi-Fi connection, because it's nice to see the faces. But of course, we know that people are in different setups and might not be able to, so that's perfectly fine as well. But yeah, I think we're ready to start. Perfect. Okay, I get a little bit nervous now when I do that. But I just want to welcome everyone to now our already 11th critical dialogue on reconciliation. My name is Lucia. I'm a member of Embrace Dialogue. And today, this dialogue will be talking about the journey towards reconciliation of ex-FARC members through the lenses of participatory textile making research projects. So it's a really interesting topic. We have an expert on hand for that who will be introduced in just a moment. But I just wanted to tell you, this event is part of a series of dialogues organized by the Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, us, so Embrace Dialogue, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies. And the series seeks to prompt a multicultural, interdisciplinary, global dialogue about reconciliation. Right now, Embrace Dialogue is sort of in the midst of celebrating 10 years since we were founded. So it's a really important time for us. And in this 10th year, we're incredibly delighted about our partnership with the University of Winchester, especially their Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and of course, OxPeace as well. If you don't know us yet, just very briefly about who we are. Embrace Dialogue, or Rodemos el Diálogo, is a Colombian peace-building organization promoting the culture of dialogue. You will hear what the culture of dialogue means to us in just a moment by André. And we're involved in different aspects of peace building. We work in Colombia a little bit more on ground and peace pedagogy, youth-led projects, for example, but also on a global level where we do dialogues such as this one today, where we try to think about how the learnings from our work in Colombia could also be applied to other spaces around the world. And at the same time, we're always really, really thankful to learn from other places around the world and try to bring those learnings back to Colombia. We're especially delighted today because I see it's quite a international group here today, so that's always really fantastic as it brings so many different viewpoints into the dialogues that we have. Critical dialogues of reconciliation are also so important to us because reconciliation is really at the center of our work, and sort of through this series of events we will continue to invite practitioners, academics, decision makers to share their research policies and activities around reconciliation. We believe that reconciliation is really a critical issue today, and it needs a critical approach to address the legacies of sort of long-lasting divisions within and between societies around the world. In the chat box of this Zoom, I will post links to where you can subscribe to our newsletter, also follow our work. There's also a whole video series of all the previous critical dialogues on reconciliation on our YouTube channel. So you'll get a link to that as well. And if you can't find anything or would like to know more, want to get in touch, please do so. We're always happy to meet new people and discuss the work we're really passionate about. But I think that's it. Once again, on behalf of Embrace Dialogue, the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, welcome. I'm now handing over to Dr. André Gomez Suarez, the Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and importantly also co-founder of Rodemos el Diálogo, who will convene today's dialogue and introduce today's very special guest. So André, you can now be nervous instead of me.
Thank you, Lucia. That's wonderful. And thank you, Berit, for accepting this invitation. And thank you to all of you who are here today. I mean, I see new faces, but I also see people who have come to previous dialogues. And that's fantastic because this is the idea of this series, that we create a process of thinking together. And that doesn't happen overnight or in one session. It really happens over meetings that need to unfold into different moments in time. So all of you, welcome, and probably people who are watching us on our live stream. At the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, we have a very similar vision than Rodemos el Diálogo, and for that reason we're very happy to partner with Rodemos el Diálogo, that basically works in Colombia, and also with the Oxpeats network that tries to bring academics across Oxford University to think about the challenges for peace building. In particular, in the center, we believe in social justice and compassion to make a difference in the world. And the center is the front line of the work of the University of Winchester to try to work on peace and reconciliation. And we do believe that in order to advance in social justice, the 6 principles that Embrace Dialogue has been creating are really, really important. And so because of the 6 principles and because they are essential for the space of dialogue that we want to organize today, I want to bring them to the table so that you can be mindful of these principles throughout the next hour and a half that we are going to be here. So the first principle is generosity. We invite you to be fully present in this space. We know that it's difficult. We know that sometimes people have multiple windows open and checking the phones and all of that. But if you could be fully present, that would be really, really amazing, because then that would nurture collective thinking. Then secondly, we believe in solidarity. We understand that by trying to feel how others feel, we can unleash empathy, and empathy is fundamental for building peace. The third principle is co-responsibility. We invite you to try to keep and hold this space together. We want to create a space of trust, and that's really important that each one of you, with your questions, with your ideas, can contribute to this space of dialogue. The fourth principle is honesty. We want to invite you to speak from experience and to recognize your questions, your doubts, your assumptions. The fifth principle is respect. We invite you to see your own reactions to what other people think and to suspend judgment, to feel awe for what we are creating together. And the final principle is self-criticism. So the idea is that we invite you to embrace intellectual humility, to make sure that you are critical or self-reflective on your own assumptions, so that we can probably even change our own mind in this space together. So these principles are fundamental for today's dialogue. And I also want to say that this is a space that is not a seminar, this is not a lecture, this is a space for dialogue. And what do we mean by dialogue? Is a horizontal process, quite close to something that the quantum physicist David Bohm used to say, by saying that dialogue is a stream of meaning flowing among and through and between us. So what we want to do in this space is to try to create that stream of meaning. So you are invited to bring your own ideas. You are invited not only to bring questions, but in particular to really try to add to our stream of meaning so that we can create something together. So let's move away from old patterns of interaction. Let's stop this hierarchical relationship and let's just do this together. So how this is gonna work? Well, the first thing is that Berit and I are gonna try to have a dialogue, the two of us, for the first half an hour, probably less, so that we can give you enough ideas, enough elements for you to start joining with your own ideas, the conversation and your own questions. The idea is that during that time, you don't need to drop any questions or any comments of the chat, but you need to allow your own thought process to flow and to see your own patterns of thinking. Then, after we finish, I will invite you to start joining this collective dialogue for 45 minutes. The idea is that if you can, you turn your camera on and you voice your comments, your questions, your doubts, your agreements or disagreements, your ideas into the conversation. Then we listen to 2 or 3, depending on how long you take, and then we come back to Berit and we'll hear what she has to say, where her patterns of thinking are going, how they have been flowing, and to bring them back to the table, and then we will open another round of comments, questions, to try to continue building this flow of meaning together. So please be aware that this dialogue is being live streamed on YouTube, so you will be recorded. And by the end of the dialogue, what I would try to do in the last 5 minutes is try to wrap up and try to offer some food for thought, so for you to carry on thinking about these ideas in your own space once we leave this space today. So without further ado, let me just introduce and welcome our very special guest to the 11th Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation, Professor Berit Bliesemann de Guevara. She is Professor of International Politics and founding director of the Center of International Politics of Knowledge. She is the principal investigator of a research project called Creating Safer Space, Strengthening Civilian Protection Amidst Violent Conflict, and of another project called Unstitching the Subjects of Colombia's Reconciliation Processes, both at the University of Aberystwyth. Before joining Aberystwyth in 2012, she held academic positions at Bremen University in Germany and Helmut Schmidt University of the Federal Armed Forces in Hamburg, Germany, and as a researcher in the project Who Governs the Sociology of UN Administrations at the University of Nottingham. She was also a visiting fellow at Uppsala University in Sweden, Potsdam University in Germany, and Bremen University in the Institute for Advanced Studies. Berit co-edits the Nomos book series Centrum and Periphery. She is editorial board member of the Bristol University Press series Spaces of Peace, Security, Development, International Peacekeeping, the Journal of Intervention and State Building, Civil Wars, and the Routledge Studies in Intervention and State Building. She is fellow of the Higher Education Academy, member of the Peer Review College and the UCRI Future Researchers Fellowship Peer Review College, and steering committee member of the Center for International Development Research at Aberystwyth University. So we have a fantastic person here with us, and with that in mind, and knowing that Berit has been doing all of this incredible research, I would like Berit to kick us off with our dialogue, asking you a first sort of question that is got to do to try to give people a bit of background. Well, we know that the Colombian government and the FARC signed a peace agreement in 2016, but what we don't know is how has been this reconciliation process. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, could you describe the reincorporation process of the ex-FARC you have worked with?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andre, and thanks for the lovely introduction. It makes me dizzy just to listen to all the things you were listing. No wonder I feel overworked most of the time. Today I want to talk specifically about that project, Unstitching Gazes, or Destejiendo Miradas in Spanish, which is a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Antioquia in Medellin, and especially my colleague Beatriz Arias Lopez, who leads the project there. So what we did was we basically took the opportunity of the peace agreement between the Colombian government and this oldest guerrilla group in Latin America, the FARC, as an opportunity to really learn a bit more about ex-combatants. How's their sense of self? Who are they? How is their sense of self changing in the reincorporation process? And how do they build relationships at the micro level with the communities where they are now settling, now that they're kind of reincorporating into society, and those communities which have quite often actually massively suffered during the violence. So basically what we wanted to know in a kind of, if you wanted in one question or in a nutshell, is kind of how do people actually author and re-author their lives after violent conflict in order to be able to live on and to live together. And to explore that question, what we did was we worked in 2 particular communities over the span of a whole year of traveling to these communities, which was cut. It should have been a year and a half, but it was cut short due to the pandemic. And one of them is the ECTR Llano Grande in La Beiba. So an ECTR areas, the so-called territorial capacitation and reincorporation space. That is one of those areas that were designated by the Colombian state for the settlement of demobilized ex-combatants. And here we have people from different units of the FARC that have come together to live there. And in that particular space in Llano Grande, we worked with some adults, but we mainly worked with the local school teacher and a group of pupils, where some children are children of ex-combatants and others, also called peace signatories, and others are children of the local communities, and they go to school together. So that was one location. And then the other location, we worked in something called a new reincorporation area in San Jose de Leon in Mutata. And that is a village that was built by a former fighting unit of the FARC, the Front 58, Frente 58, on their own initiative. So basically, they stayed together, they put the money together, they received in this reincorporation process, bought the land and built a livelihood there. And this is where we undertook most of our field work, as I said, over a period of a year, but I say we, so the team at the time, we were 10 people, so I was not there all the time, obviously, because I'm based in the UK, but especially the Colombian colleagues, groups of 2 or 3 people went back every month for at least a week to work there. So 2 quite different reincorporation models, I would say, where we work not just with the peace signatories, but also their families and the kind of the surrounding community, so the people who already lived there before they settled there. And maybe just a word on who we didn't work with, because that wasn't kind of our focus at the time. We didn't actually work with, so we worked with people who kind of reincorporated collaboratively, right, as a group. And stayed together as a group. But there are lots of people who try to make their civilian life now in the cities and so on as single individuals, sometimes also anonymously, so not really telling too much about their history as a FARC fighter. And our project didn't cover those people. So these are collective processes, really.
No, that's amazing. And so children, communities, the families of former members of the FARC. I wonder, I have a question out of what you have been sharing with us, and it's got to do with the composition of the members, of the FARC themselves. Were they mainly women? Were they male? What was their age? I mean, with the former combatants in particular in these 2 regions, and whether whether that implied different also strategies for each one of the 2 spaces.
Yeah. So I would say age-wise, we had the whole age span, so we didn't actually plan to work with children. But when you do workshops, and I'll talk a bit about our methods maybe later on, but when you do workshops in spaces where there is no childcare, of course the children participate as well, but they weren't former combatants. But the combatants were anywhere between the age of 20, 23 perhaps, all the way up to more elderly people. Some of them who weren't active fighters at the time of the peace agreement, but perhaps were political prisoners or had left the FARC already because they had been injured during the war, but were now joining these new places where they were settling. So a whole range of people, and both men and women. As well. So we also had in our project a range of different people of different ages and genders. Perhaps we had a few more women than men. And when I talk a bit more about what you've already said before, Lucia, our textile methods, that might explain a bit why. But we also tried to work with people that are perhaps not always interviewed or involved in research by researchers who tend to go to the kind of leaders of places and work with them. At least that's what our observation was by being there quite a long time. And we tried to work also with other people to get their voices and kind of have a bigger circle of people to talk to.
Yeah, and after what you have said, and this is of course taking us there, there is no other way, is I guess related precisely with the participants, but you and we have it on the title of this dialogue. You decided to choose textile making as a research method. So why don't you explain to us a bit like this methodology that you choose and why you choose this methodology?
Yeah, so as I said, we wanted to figure out how people's sense of self, so their subjectivity, is changing in the transformation process, and how these relationships with others who perhaps before were kind of enemies, or had kind of an at least an image of the other as the internal enemy, how that is kind of working at this micro level. And to do that, we used a range of different methods. So we didn't just use textile making, but we used a range of method held together by an approach that is called narrative practice. So basically, narrative practice assumes that all of us, we make sense of ourselves and our world around us through telling stories of our lives. So we pick kind of experiences and put them into some sort of coherent narrative about who we are and what the world around us is about, and so on. We do that all the time, but also we don't draw on all of our experiences. So there's some we might always talk about in a professional setting, because that's kind of the dominant way of presenting ourselves, because we've learned to do that this way. But we are much more multifaceted than that one single story. And that's interesting because it allows both individuals, but also collectives, to re-narrate their story, right? To be seen differently. And really kind of the starting point where we came from was the observation that when we started in 2018 or 2017, when we wrote the proposal for the project, there was still a lot of talk about kind of the form of art combatants as the other in society, kind of the internal enemy, the delinquents, the criminals, and so on. And the idea was to kind of unstitch really these kind of dominant narratives, and to come, I think it kind of relates to your 6 principles, to really come to this kind of idea of creating some empathy, or just to listen, to create that space to also listen to other experiences. So basically what we did then was we went to the places where we did our project, and we used different methods. So we interviewed people, we did kind of biographical interviews with them to learn more about their lives. And these, quite often, you can really see kind of dominant narratives that come out of interviews, but also the things people don't say, right? You know, something was going on during the conflict, but nobody talks about it. So that's kind of a silence story. But then we were specifically interested in kind of people's, so what's called the preferred stories. How would people like to talk about the process they are going through? How do they see it, and how do they want others to see them in that process? So what are these preferred stories they would like other Colombians to tell? And to do that, we invited them to embroider their preferred stories if they wanted to. So that was kind of the starting point for that. And just as with interviews, I mean, you invite people for interviews, and some of them say, yeah, fine, and others say, no way, I don't want to be interviewed. And it's the same with textile making. Some people want to be involved and others don't. And I think in total, we had over 120 people between peace signatories and local communities who engaged in our textile making.
And so you would, I mean, I'm trying to imagine the scenario. So you would come with textiles, with fabric, you would bring needles, you would bring, and you would give them, and they could choose like different colors, different, like sort of things. And then would you give them any instructions to say, you need to produce this, you need to do this? Did you do a bit of sort of capacity building, so that for people who probably have never done embroidery before? Was it challenging for the FARC? I mean, like I know that I'm probably here now reproducing a stereotype, but allow me to use it to try to see how probably some people are thinking. You have these people in the middle of the jungle with rifles fighting a war. Probably they just keep those rifles, and that's what they know what to do. So somehow to change a rifle for a needle, and then, so how did you sort of brought them into, what were the challenges of getting into the practicality of the embroidery?
Yeah, maybe I talk a bit through the process, how we did it, and then I say something on your last point, which will hopefully surprise you positively. So the process was that we went, so let's take the case of San Jose de Leon. We went there to see whether they wanted to work with us at all. And they did, and this village has a so-called gender and women's committee with both kind of peace signatories, but also other people in the community, and they meet regularly. So they allowed us to use one of these meetings to introduce our project. And we did a very first kind of meeting just to introduce ourselves, introduce each other, and see what people's expectations were around our project idea. And then we organized two or three further workshops. I can't quite remember how many, but one was about this idea of introducing this narrative practices idea or approach that that I mentioned before. And the way we did it, there's a poem by a Brazilian poet, which is called "I'm Made of Scraps." And this poem is basically about how our lives are almost like a patchwork made of little scraps of the lives we cross, so the people we meet, the things we experience, and so on. And all these little things come together and make who we are, but also make how we interact with others. And it's a really lovely, not very long poem. And we read it together, and we took this idea of life being made out of scraps to ask them. So we had a whole mountain of textile scraps that we had brought with us to ask people to choose colors and forms and so on, just sew it for the first workshop just onto a piece of paper and think about what are the most important scraps they think their life has been kind of made of or kind of composed of. And that was really amazing because it wasn't about anything artistic, but people just started talking about the really important things that happened in their lives just through this little exercise. And then we followed that up with, and obviously everything was always voluntary and people could come or not, but people came back, and we did probably 2 workshops where we just showed some embroidery stitches, kind of just some basic stuff to say, this is what you could be doing when we invite you to embroider your preferred narratives. And then you would be surprised because everybody in the FARC knows how to sew, because when you're in the guerrilla and then you're in war, you have no one, your mom's not gonna mend your clothes for you, so you have to do it yourself, right? So you have to mend your uniform, but also everybody had a code, like a personal code. They would embroider into their clothes to find the t-shirts. If they were all washed together, for example, you would find your own t-shirt. And this code was quite often embroidered in chain stitch, which is quite a complicated thing, but they all did it to perfection, really. So there was really no kind of idea that sewing or embroidering wasn't for men and women, but really a kind of, rather the question of, did they really want to engage in this idea of, oh, what's my preferred story, that would make people participate in the further process or not. What we did from the workshops onwards was then to say, workshops always had to be in the evening when nobody is working, but then that makes it difficult because it's quite dark and the light is not particularly great. And then how do you thread a needle when it's very dark? So we offered people, we would come to their home, for example, during their lunch break or something, and just sit with them and talk and embroider kind of in smaller groups, perhaps for an hour or so if they wanted to. And obviously we left all the stuff there so they could just continue with their work when we were away as well.
Well, that's amazing. And of course, I guess, that's what the sort of lack of understanding or the fog that is created in your mind when you are in the middle of war is that you don't really see the other as a complex human being. So suddenly you just simplify who you think the other is. And, this idea of, oh, they only have rifles, but they didn't know many practical things that are so useful in everyday life is something that we start to learn when we engage and we encounter the other. And I think that's great. But it must be also challenging. And I want to then sort of, for us to try to think about the challenges that you found for reconciliation, because it sounds like, well, if all of them were thinking the same, if all of them were members of the FARC, well, probably that's sort of okay, because probably they share a similar historical narrative of why they did what they did, who their idols are, how they see the other, and things like that. But suddenly bringing these textile scraps that are so important for them in the context where there are also community leaders and members of a community who probably were harmed by the FARC, probably not by the people they are sitting with, but by members of that organization. Probably that's very challenging. So my question is, what were, through this process that you went through, what were the challenges that you found for reconciliation, or also the opportunities, you know, where that you thought, wow, these really surprised us?
Yeah, I think there are obviously a lot of challenges, which we were there, we observed what was going on and so on, and there are lots of challenges, and I think, yeah, you could probably guess. So some of them are kind of in some of these reincorporation spaces, the question around the socioeconomic future, right? So how do what we've built here, how will this become self-sustaining once the state is gone and doesn't provide any help anymore? So in San Jose de Leon, it was a bit different because they had bought the land and was clear the land would stay with them. But in some of the other spaces, it wasn't clear whether people could actually remain where they had now settled and so on, because the land question wasn't clear and so on. So there are these kind of very broad questions, and also, I mean, those of you who follow a bit politics and what's happening in Colombia know that, well, there's a peace agreement with one group, but there's still a lot of violence, and there's a lot of violence also against social leaders, but also against peace signatories. So a lot of them have been killed through targeted killings since they've signed the agreement. So I think all of these are kind of things that were reflected in some of the embroideries. So we kind of, the embroiders we grouped them into almost like chapters of a book, if you can think about it that way, around themes. And these themes were very much around emotions. And there was one about uncertainties. And these were things kind of that came up on both sides, so to speak, among the peace signatories, but also among the communities, people who had lived through a lot of different peace agreements and settlements and this and that, and who've seen kind of violence come back to rural areas, basically. So there was a lot of uncertainty around that. And then there are also obviously things like, so questions around gender. I mean, the FARC is known to have negotiated a very progressive peace agreement in terms of gender and so on. But then, well, when you sometimes look into these spaces, you see very traditional kind of roles that people take on in peace times. Questions around how should such a community be organized? So is it probably to build something, it's quite useful if you have clear hierarchies and you just work together and somebody tells you this is what we're going to do and you just do it. But then kind of in the long term, you want to think about more democratic structures, more kind of collective decision making and so on. And there were some tensions when we were there, at least, which is now also some time ago with the pandemic and the end of the project. So who knows how things have developed. So ours is just a small snapshot of where we were. So I would say there are lots of challenges. At the same time, I think our process also showed, so when you have themes that come out of these textiles, like around roots, where people come from, you can see really how the local communities and the peace signatories all come from probably quite impoverished rural backgrounds. They share a lot of stories of how their childhoods were and so on. There was a lot in common. There was a lot in common about the topic of trust as well, of coming together after the violent conflict. And there was nobody we talked to who said, oh, this is not working, or this is not better than it was before. Everybody said this, however imperfect the situation is so much better than what we had before. So there was absolutely no doubt that the peace agreement with the FARC was a very good thing, because these are the areas that have most suffered from the violent conflict. So I think what this textile work does, and maybe one element that I haven't mentioned, if I may have another 2 minutes or so, is we exhibited these textiles as well, and we used them so both in the communities where we worked, but also then, for example, in Medellin, and now in a follow-on project in Bogota and Cali, in Popayan. And we use the textiles to create dialogue as well. And I think that's what is important. So it's not just an exercise as such, or for us to get some data to write our articles about this, but it's really a way of bringing people who might otherwise not really meet together and talk to each other through the textiles. So people go to the exhibitions, learn something about rural communities' lives and trajectories. And then we asked them if they would like to resonate. So what does it make you think, and what does it make you want to embroider to resonate what they see? Does it kind of does it resonate within them? Do they have something they can relate to? And a lot of people want to embroider something. So we have little kind of embroideries in answer to the things they've seen in the exhibitions. And I think what it creates is somehow the peace agreement has opened up space to talk about other violences, the more structural violences. We work a lot now with young people in these urban centers of Colombia, because we want to engage them as well in that conversation where Colombia is going, and kind of the violences they are concentrating on are different from the violent conflict, but they're linked to the violent conflict. And it's kind of, and it gives you this fabric. So it doesn't all have to be, not everybody has to be of the same opinion or something, but there's just a space for dialogue and for what we probably call like coexistence with difference or something, rather than, so we don't really use the term reconciliation that much. I think also because it's kind of used very polemically.
Of course. It makes me think a lot, and I wonder what the members of Rodemos el Diálogo who are here are thinking about, because we, for a long time, Rodemos, as Lucia says, has been going on for 10 years. But for many years, we never used the word reconciliation, actually. And our main focus was on dialogue. And what I find interesting with what you are saying is how you engage people on dialogue through the textile making. So it's like a non-cognitive sort of invitation. You engage other parts of the brain at the same time that people start engaging in a dialogue. And I wonder if some members of Rodemos el Diálogo in this meeting, or people who come to the space of Rodemos el Diálogo, are thinking that this is the sort of things that we could do together with you, or to start exploring these sort of things. It also makes me, and it makes me think a lot what you were saying now about the importance of thinking about beyond the language communication, because we tend to pay so much attention to the either written word or the spoken word, but there are so many things that are not said verbally that are so absolutely fundamental. And in these spaces, you seem to have had that possibilities of people interacting beyond the cognitive dimension of things. So I hope that people already have ideas and questions that want to ask you, or things that they want to share. I just want to probably turn to you, Berit, before, and I would like to ask people to start putting their hands up or writing in the chat option me, so that you can be the next one to start flowing into this stream of meaning that we're trying to create here. But before we do that, so that people have the chance to do that, let me go back to you with one sort of request or question, and is what would you like to know from the people who are sitting here in this dialogue after what you have been sharing? If you were to ask them a question, for example, what would you like to put on the table so that people can also think about that, and that you would probably like to hear from them, since you are not on their side, but on this side, sort of speaking?
Yeah, I would probably use the questions we have used in our project, which is always like, if you look into narrative practice, there are two core questions people ask when you ask them to resonate with what they've heard. And one is, what caught your interest? What did you find particularly interesting about what you heard? And the other one is, how do you actually relate to that? Because I think this relating makes then things bigger and turns them into dialogue, really. And I guess you're right with what you said about going away just from linguistic and cognitive ways of knowing and relating to these other ways. I think John Paul Lederach said something about peace process not just being technical, but they have to be creative, so you can create new imaginations. And it might, while you negotiate a peace agreement and so on, it might be kind of marginal. But once that's in place, that's not the work done. That's when the work actually starts. And then it's about other things than those technical things, I suppose. And it's about kind of creating that space for dialogue. And I think, we work with textiles, so I don't work with pottery or any other craft. So I don't know whether that would be the same. But the textile has something that makes I don't know, that speaks through the body. It's almost a message created through the body, through the hand, and it's received with the body. And you can see that when people come to textile exhibitions, how they react quite differently than they would to a photo, for example. We had a joint exhibition with some photographs, and sorry to say, but the photographers didn't get that much resonance out of their photo. Not to say that photos can't have resonances, but I think we're more used to them, perhaps, from the media. So yeah, so that would be my questions. What did you find particularly interesting, or do you find particularly interesting? How do you resonate? So how do you relate to what you heard?
Well, there you go. I can see that there already, at least I have someone in the chat asking to jump into this space and open this stream. I'll have to say that I'm gonna leave one question hanging, because probably it's going through the heads of our students here and people who have been working on reconciliation, and is that for many people, when you are thinking about reconciliation processes between communities and perpetrators, of people who were in arms and people who suffered the violence on the other side, the first question that comes to mind is forgiveness or apologies. And I've never heard that. I don't know if there were spaces that were quite tense in which people said, yeah, well, I know that you want us to focus on the preferred narratives of how we want to see us, but actually these guys did this. And whether there were some spontaneous moments in which there was a need to deal with the past, and in which there was a need of an acknowledgement of responsibility or something, and if there was a need for an expression of forgiveness from the side of the communities to build trust. But I'm just going to put it on the table, because probably, towards the conversation, you might want to bring that back and say, oh, I just remembered this sort of thing. But let's leave it there, flowing into this beautiful stream of meaning that we are trying to create, for the time being, floating, sorry. And then, Laura Hankin, over to you.
Thanks, Andre. I'm going to try with my video, but because of the wonderful weather that's happening here, I might have to turn it off again. Hi, everyone. Hi, Berit. Thank you so much for telling us about the projects and all of the comments that are coming up. That are coming up in my head now as a result. Partly interesting, I resonate with it in a very direct way, in the fact that I'm actually currently in Llano Grande, where you were doing your research. And I was here when you were doing your research before, because I did my fieldwork back in 2019. So it's interesting to see how things have moved on as well for me, having done my research at that point. The other bit that did strike me, though, was the same as what Andre had mentioned about using textiles as a means of opening dialogue. So I found it really interesting in terms of how the exhibitions were a way of sort of opening those spaces. But I guess the bit that I'm kind of thinking about more is the idea of people telling the narrative side of it. So people telling their stories through those things that they kind of maybe feel it has meaning for them, or how they want to project themselves. But I think also it's really interesting because often it's done through speaking, right? So it's the kind of stories that we rehearse, and when you're interviewed over and over and over again, which has often happened in a lot of these spaces, the same kind of stories start to come up, and those are the things that people then hold on to, and the other bits kind of get pushed even further away. So I find it fascinating that you kind of open a different space through textile work, through the needlework. And I guess that raises a question, because Andre put at the end there about reconciliation and thinking about other people, and I always wonder as well about the reconciliation that goes on internally. And I wondered if, having done that work, did it create different stories that they wanted to tell, or new ways that they wanted to present themselves, or made them think about themselves differently as they were doing it? I'd really like to hear that bit. And I also just wanted to ask, is there any way we can get a link to the poem you were talking about as well? Because I would love to read it and see what that starting point was. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Amazing, Laura. And the good thing is that since you are in Llano Grande, probably you can go and also engage in a dialogue to see what was the internal reconciliation process as a follow-up research.
So yeah, there has been that bit. and I have some of the same people because they were talking about it when I was here before. So I do know some of those same people even at that point. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Well, there is a stream opening up here to carry on chatting. I'm pretty sure that Berit would love to see what these people that you've been speaking to have been thinking about what they went through. So thank you, Laura, and amazing. Thank you for bringing that into this space. Let me just tell the other ones, this is a good time if you want to turn on your cameras also and keep them on. If you want to engage more in this dialogue, to turn your cameras on. But, of course, if you don't want, that's fine. But when you are going to speak or when you are going to voice something, please, we ask you to try to put your cameras on because it would be more engaging for us. I can see that Lucia is also put her hand up. So, Lucia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you, Berit. It was really, really interesting. And actually, what it made me think of is a completely different setting. But in the summers, I go to a camp with non-verbal kids. So it's children who can't communicate verbally directly. And so what we do is sort of, it's workshops with instruments. They're not meant to create beautiful music at all. We play around, it's very tactile. It sort of brings us all on the same level because if no one's speaking, then we're all sort of, we're equal in the ability to communicate. And it's really interesting because the goals of those workshops are not necessarily to communicate everything, but the body communicates without you thinking about it. And so there's this like things that people do and how they express themselves and our understanding of what they want to say. And even for the kids that are verbal and for us who participate in this, the words come later after the physical part has happened. And it made me think also how now that we're celebrating 10 years with Red, we've been doing this workshop last week where we were drawing a river that was sort of representing our journey within Embrace Dialogue. And I was thinking how actually drawing the river has brought up ways of seeing how you engaged with your history or engaged with like what you've been experiencing. And it's just made me think of like the various ways that we can communicate that might aid and help us to then verbally communicate later on and kind of work through various ways. And I just thought I think this project is just so interesting because maybe there's like a part of that happens when you're doing this very physical, tactile activity of stitching. That is a little bit of a comment. It's not a real question.
That's the idea. This is not a seminar, so you're bringing and you're adding to this stream of meaning. So thank you so much, Lucia. Let's see if there is someone else who would like to jump in. With a comment, a question. Fantastic. Frances, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. What struck me was I started thinking of other countries I've been in where people have been knitting together. So I lived with an Icelandic family and the wife didn't speak English and she knitted jumpers. And so I started to learn to knit and I would just knit with her every evening in front of the TV and we couldn't communicate, but I remember it strongly. It was a way of like linking with the culture and linking with her as well. So, and also I guess because you don't have to have eye contact all the time, you're doing something with your hands as well as sort of sharing in something. So that kind of really struck me. I was also just wondering, I had a question about what happens to the actual, because there's a process of making the textiles and that sort of internal process that happens to the individual and the community, but also what happens with the end product as well. I know you mentioned the exhibitions, and then after that, so I was quite curious to know the legacy of it, kind of what happens with what they've made.
Thank you, Frances. Okay, I think we've been, going through this stream for a bit, and I think this is time to touch base with Berit. Just to, as I said, Berit, you don't need to answer all the questions; they are just provocations. But what we would like to hear is where is your thought process at this moment, and what you want to share with us, and how we can continue weaving this together as if we were embroidering.
Yeah, no, sounds good. But I will answer the last question about what's going to happen with the pieces, because I think it's an important question when you do these kind of projects, that you don't like take it away and it's yours all of a sudden. So we have taken pictures of all the pieces, and Lucia has helpfully put a link to our website if you want to have a look at what it actually looks like. We have a website, and there's also a bilingual book where all these original textiles, and you can have a look at them. We've borrowed them, so to speak, because we have this follow-on project with these young people in these 4 cities in Colombia. So we are showing them and working with them, but the idea is that they will travel back to their makers. Hopefully they're still where we met them. So maybe we won't know where everybody has ended up, but most of them will still be there. And then our hope is, of course, that they will do something with them rather than just kind of putting them somewhere in the drawer or throwing them away, that maybe they have some sort of exhibition. So usually there's a casa común, so some sort of communal space or somewhere where they might want to show them, or at least take them out every once in a while, because it is their work. That's the idea. But for the time being, we're allowed to travel around with them. And we've also brought some people from the communities we worked with to some of our exhibitions in Colombia, just so that they could see what it looks like, not in their own community, but in a space in Medellin, perhaps, and give some talks around their experiences. So that's the idea. Yeah, I think, yeah, so several other things that came up was, I think the 2 things I want to talk about was, on the one hand, kind of what does this non-intellectual doing something tactile and so on, what does it do? And I think, again, there's something especially about textile making, but probably also about other kind of creative engagements where textile, so embroidering takes a lot of time, right? So if you have some sort of idea, but it takes some time to do it. And then depending on your personal skill, you make a lot of knots, or maybe you don't. We had one participant who wanted to, so from Llano Grande, who wanted to embroider just with one. So if you know embroidery yarn, it's made up of 3 out of 6 single strands, right? They are kind of spun together, and usually for embroidery you use 2 or 3 of them, because it's easier to thread them through the needle. He just did it with one single of these embroidery strands, and he made a whole anatomical heart out of this red kind of yarn, and it's a lot of work. It took ages for him to make. It's beautiful, it's really beautiful work, but yeah, I think there's something about taking the time, and taking that time to reflect on what you actually want, what you feel, what you want to remember, what you want to say. So something evolves also together with the material you are using. So you maybe have something in mind, but the material just has another idea about what you can or cannot do with it. So something comes out of this process. And I think that's very important for kind of reflection, because this talking thing is always very quick. And then we resort to what Laura also said, these kind of rehearsed stories, right? So if I just ask you something, you tell something rehearsed because you've told it 10 times before. But this kind of really kind of, I think, gets people to think a bit differently about their experiences. And then when you interview them or ask them about why they've embroidered this or that, or in this particular way, they might have different answers. And the other well, whether these answers were then actually created by our process, of course, it's hard to say, because we don't really have the comparison of what it would have been like to not do the process. Although that said, I would say the things they told us in the typical kind of biographical interview we did, when we also had the same person engaging in our embroidery process, and in that case, the stories that they had as preferred stories they wanted other people to know about them were quite different. And I think that's also why, so these tense situations that you're talking about, there were critical points, so especially these uncertainties and so on. There are critical points in some of the embroideries, but I think more of these kind of tense situations came up more in interviews, and when we kept asking about certain things, so kind of about, for example, the involvement of a particular fighting unit they had been part of in a particular massacre that we just knew about historically, right? And then would perhaps kind of try to ask a bit about that. if they wanted to talk about it. And that was more when tensions came up. But the whole project wasn't about forgiveness. And we also didn't tell people to reflect or tell us about anything kind of in the past that was related to particular violences. If they wanted to, and some people wanted to, they did. If they didn't want to, they didn't. And that wasn't the point of the project, so to speak, because we were not the special jurisdiction for peace or the Truth Commission, or so it wasn't about establishing facts about the violent past, but about kind of this transformation process and what people are making of it. And then I found it quite striking that especially the people from these rural communities were really, you could say, embracing. So after a first doubts about, oh God, do these people really have to settle here now? They were embracing this kind of process and the kind of trust building. So there were a lot of embroiders playing football together or shaking hands. Shaking hands is one of the embroideries which captures the very first moment when the peace signatories arrived in San Jose de Leon. They put up some tents and they started kind of building this village, and kind of local communities arrived. And one of the women said, oh, he laid down his weapon to come over to us and shake hands with us. So that's the moment captured in that embroidery. And I think that was kind of what people were, they wanted to highlight the good things, not the tensions, which are there. But when they wanted to talk about this, and they knew that there was kind of doubt about the peace process in some of the urban areas and so on, they just wanted to say, for us, it's a good thing. I think that's why that doesn't necessarily show up so much in the embroideries.
But this thing that you are saying is so important, and makes me think a lot about, when you said that reconciliation is a difficult term, and it's many times you don't really need to talk about reconciliation to be working on reconciliation. You are doing other things, but at the end of the day, what you're doing through those things is to focusing on the present, to mend relationships by activities that are practical activities. And that's extremely, sort of powerful in a way. Whereas it makes me, and I guess many of the people who work on reconciliation sometimes are really worried, because they think, people think that we are inviting them to forgive, or we are inviting them to acknowledge responsibility, when it's no, we're just inviting you to find ways to live together. And sometimes there are tensions, but there are also all the beautiful things that emerge without you having to think about it. You just create the practical space to make it happen, and that looks to me like a really inspiring thing. I've seen that Eric had been for a long time, I thought he was clapping, and then I thought, no, probably that's too many claps. Maybe what he was trying to do was to ask a question. So Eric, or make a comment, obviously. So Eric, over to you. You are muted.
Yeah, so my internet keeps cutting in and out. My big thoughts with reconciliation is that God has got to be at the heart of it, and as it's mostly a Christian country. And the biggest thing with God is that if I say, who are my enemies, they're not necessarily God's enemies, and so I'm fighting against people who God loves, and that has to be at the heart of everything. True justice can never happen on the scale that it's happened that it used to happen in Colombia, because it's over 3 generations, and at some point one generation has possibly got to give up the right for justice so that their children and their grandchildren can live in peace. That there has to be that need and that thought that there is a greater priority than justice almost. And the other thing with justice is that, if we want our children and our families to live in peace, our enemies also have to live in peace, and somehow or other that has to be a greater priority. And it's lovely to hear all the stories about the embroidery and things, but it just, a thought really was that if one group who were responsible for destroying something were also part of rebuilding that something, I think that would be an enormous thing to aim for, that you're showing a more practical love, that you're very sorry that it's happened in the past, and how you would ever get that to happen, I really don't know. And how you get victims to give up their right for justice, again, I don't know. But when we turn to God, and if it's 3/4 of the country is Christian, then very clearly it says the greatest thing we can do, we can't do anything greater, is to love all our neighbours and even to love and pray for our enemies. So we haven't got a choice. If we look for a God solution, we have to put that first and above everything else.
Thank you, Eric.
Extremely difficult.
Thank you, and lots of food for thought. With no doubt that religion plays a really important role in reconciliation, and that in many cases, at least until the 1950s, 1960s, for almost 2,000 years, reconciliation was the realm of religion, whether Christianity or Islam or even, Zen Buddhism. But what is interesting is that now the international community and governments and, bureaucrats have taken on board the idea that reconciliation is also part of public policy. And so it's really interesting what you're saying, how we need to work with culture in some cases to help people, not to help, but some people resort to culture or to what they have in culture in order to move forward. And they find in God an opportunity to move in a very particular, in a direction that if they keep focusing on the idea of justice as something that is enshrined in the Constitution, they wouldn't be able to move beyond that. So really interesting. And
the one thing about forgiveness I've learned from personal experience, that it's the same to forgive somebody if they've stolen a few pounds from you, or if they're responsible for the death of a child. And the big difference is grief. And I explain it this way, that if I've lost a few pounds, I blame myself for it and I get over it, and there's not the grief is there. But then if I learn somebody's stolen these few pounds from me, then the anger takes over and I can't deal with the grief. And it's very much the same with the grief of the death of a child. If the child died by natural causes, a heart attack or something, you could grieve properly. But if there's an anger and an injustice involved, you can't grieve the child because the anger and the injustice takes over your feelings. And so the need to forgive is almost what you need to do to be able to grieve for your child who's died, as opposed to feeling the anger for the person who is responsible. And forgiveness is more for our own benefit rather than the benefit of the person we've forgiven. It's where we find peace. And I think people like Gandhi have always said that forgiveness is for our own benefit, not for the others.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, for that contribution. I've seen also Mandy's wanting to join this dialogue. So Mandy, over to you.
Hi, I have a guest here too. So hi, I have a question more out of curiosity, because with embroidery, I'm processing that this is a very symbolic way of expressing yourself, right? It's very different from words going into pictures. And that made me think about how we talk about, history in general, and how we narrate what we understand and what we live through in this case. So I was wondering if during this embroidery exercise, was there any mythology coming up or new narratives of magical realism, like kind of like going into that realm of telling a story and retelling a story in this case. With other ways of understanding not only their world, but the events that happen, and I'm guessing happen to them too. So that's out of curiosity if that happened or if that's a thing. Yeah, a pumpkin.
Thank you, Mandy. Okay, I've seen more people in the room who haven't had the chance to probably jump in or say something, I guess. And this is another moment to invite you to, is if you want to voice something, if you want to bring an idea that came into your mind just by listening to what we've been hearing from different people in the room, this is the moment. So shall we check? Someone wants to go ahead and take 10 minutes of silence? So, no minutes, pardon, sorry, 10, oh, no, even 10 seconds. We didn't even get there. Laura Alejandra Chaparro, over to you.
Hi, sorry, I'm gonna turn the camera on, but I hope that you can hear me. So I have two thoughts. One is similar to the previous comment that Mandy said. It's about, so Berit was saying that they share like similar stories, right? When they were brothering and everything, that they realized that they shared similar stories. So in that way, it's like they found some like a common causes of the conflict, the armed conflict. That's one of the questions as a conclusion. And the other one is more about, so I try to tell that people from rural zones are more into those exercises than the ones in the urban zones. I know that the exercise was not in urban areas, but when the exposition was in Medellin, in Popayán, in the big cities, I mean, how those people that were embroidering or they joined to the exercise, like answer to this situation that is like okay, I am part also of a community that was involved in the conflict or not. They felt part of that or not. So how was the response? Because really, I think that I have been working with people from the communities and they are really engaged into those exercises. But for the urban ones, not that much. So that's something that came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That's amazing. Thank you so much. I can see that Catalina has also put her hand up, but I'm going to suggest that we are going to do a last round of comments and questions. And so I want to keep her first in that next round. So in this moment, we can go back to Berit for a bit. And so two other people can just take the courage to put their hand up. And then after listening where Berit's thoughts are, we come back to a last round of you guys participating. So Berit, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your reflections. There's so much more that can be said. Yeah, I think these questions around kind of what kind of stories come out of the textiles, maybe these original ones we did, because now there are many, many more, but these original ones we did in these communities where peace signatories are reincorporating. So we looked for themes across the textiles. And when I say there were a lot of things in common, I think it's really what you say, Laura, about the kind of almost like the causes of the armed conflict, because the things that were in common were quite often the structural violences and the physical violences people had experienced already during their childhood and then throughout the conflict. And in the case of former FARC combatants who were kind of thinking about or reflecting over these topics. There were lots of stories of having lost a parent because they had been forcibly disappeared, for example, or having experienced domestic violence or just living in immense poverty. So there was a lot around that in terms of shared experiences, I guess. But there were also differences, of course, right? So especially, so there's one which is called Memories, I think. Oh my God, I've forgotten the name of the book. I think there's one which is called Memories or something similar. Where, of course, the memories of your life, if you've spent the last 30 years in the Guerrilla, what you remember will be quite different from spending the last 30 years of your life in civilian life. And there you also, I think the idea is also that you can have that plurality of memory as well, right? So that there are, and I think sometimes people find it hard to mention, but there can be fond memories, preferred places within an armed struggle. So former combatants would remember how they enjoyed just walking through the jungle or through the bush, just walking or just living together, taking baths together in the river, or how they encountered really rare animals. So kind of encounters with nature as something fun to remember, but also a fondness of remembering your weapon and how your weapon was your friend during the war is, of course, a completely different experience to experiences of civilians whose lives were quite different. But I think that it allows for this plurality of memories and still kind of some of the same experiences. So I think, yeah, the things that were the same for me point very much to those structural violences that underpin perhaps the causes of conflict, but which have also not been undone, right? So they are still there and they still have to be spoken about. And that's the interesting bit about the new kind of follow-on project that we are doing, that these young people, although the structural violences they are talking about are a bit different, they're still there. And they talk a lot about their resistances to these violences and how they imagine their future. So I'm not sure whether there's one single magical realism type story coming out of it, but I think it is a space for new stories to emerge. And I don't think we are far enough into the project for that to happen. But I think, yeah, I think it's going in that direction, really. The other question that Laura also mentioned, whether people engage differently in urban centers. Yes, I mean, one of the problems is that when you take something that you made somewhere in the territories to the city and you try to display it in, let's say, a gallery or a museum, the spaces where you can do things that were done by former combatants, at least while we were trying to do this, so up to the pandemic, were very limited, because some of the public spaces have very good or not so well hidden reasons not to display anything that has to do with former combatants. So they would say, oh, textiles, we don't do textiles in this particular museum or gallery, or no, we're already booked out, or you have to pay a lot of money for this. So once you exhibit your work then in spaces that are already in solidarity with former combatants, you kind of start preaching to the choir. That's of course a problem. But we've tried to keep working on this to be able to, even if it's just one of the books, the one that is perhaps less controversial, the one on hope or something, even if we can just display that tiny fraction of our work in a public space where you would get other people to think about the conflict as well, then something is already won. And there is I think our experience is that once people start to learn more about the complexity of the person behind the enemy or the former combatant, there's always some sort of understanding happening. And in that book that Lucia has helpfully there linked as well, when you go to the very last part of it, there are some resonances that we did before the book was printed. And some of those were done with people in Medellin, and they reflect on how they somehow had this moment where it clicked and they thought, oh yeah, we always thought the war was over there somewhere in the countryside, right? These people over there did this war, but actually we do war every day in our everyday lives when we don't communicate with people, when we don't accept who they are, and so on, when we keep kind of furthering those structural violences, and there's some sort of connection all of a sudden, that it's not just them over there, it's actually us as well. And you see that in several of these resonances of people who would say to us, oh, why are you doing this? Why do you even talk to these people? I mean, why do you have to do that project? And that was really nice to see, because it kind of confirmed that we are going in the right direction with the project. Eric,
Yeah.
I'm absolutely, I have no idea about religion whatsoever, so I'm better to shut up about any comments to do with religion.
You see, that's the beauty of a dialogue, because then people can bring what they have at their disposal to contribute to us.
But you will find God mentioned in some of the embroideries as well.
Amazing. Catalina, please, you had your hand up. We want to hear you, unless Berit has definitely answered your question or the comment that you had.
Hello, hi everyone. Yes, in a way, in the last part of her comment, somehow it was addressing to the point that I wanted to bring. So first of all, Berit, I really love your project and I have following it up, and somehow it speaks to me a lot because I've been working, a lot of my research is about telling a different story of the Medellin so-called miracle. And I'm working a lot with the storytelling, the colonial version of the storytelling as a methodological approach. And I bring art-based methods to all my work in urban planning and urban design. And for us, the imagination part is what we're good at, unless the part around memory. So I have seen that in your project, you have this connection with arpilleras from Chile and the work of another, very gendered component of people dealing with embroidery in other places of Colombia, such as Mapujan and the very famous work that they do. So I wonder to what extent you are locating your work in the debates about, how do you build memory and other strategies to bring storytelling about conflict. But to what extent, what is the role that territory and space plays in your work? Because I can see it a lot as a backdrop, and we always play with this false dichotomy, the territories and the city, the territories and the capital. And I think, oftentimes reproduce a very complicated, problematic view in, what a territory is. And my work now is trying to connect territorial peace in the urban realm. And I think the urban speciality of peace is something that I'm interested in. And I wonder to what extent your work is, building or going also in that direction.
Thanks, Kata, for bringing these comments about space. We can see your architecture background and all of that emerging beautifully. Michael, I see that you are next, so over to you, Michael.
Oh, thank you. Firstly, to say thank you very much for the dialogue. Very interesting and fascinating way of therapy, helping people come to reconfigure their lives. I suppose how did you cope with this? Some of the images you must have seen must have been very traumatic. How did you cope with some of those difficult images that were brought up?
Okay, thank you, Michael. That's great. And I can see Isaac, our last participant here. So Isaac, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, because of my internet, my camera is off. Now I have two questions here. The first one is about this project of Textile. So I want to ask, during this project, did you bring the perpetrators and the victims together in that same single space? And if you did, I mean, was there any form of negative or aggressive reaction from the victims to the perpetrator? Then secondly, at the long run, overall, did the project build peace in Colombia? And if yes, what are the indicators or the measurements that were used to determine that the project actually built peace? Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. You see, I'm delighted to see some of the students of the Masters in Reconciliation and Peace Building of the University of Sussex being very eager to ask you questions, and that's fantastic, Berit. So, please feel free to try to answer the questions that you feel like you would like to answer, or to just share your thoughts now, to take us to the next place. And this would be the last sort of time that we hear from you, and then I will do a sort of wrapping up. But over to you, Berit, to just help us continue building this stream of meaning together.
Yeah, thank you. I think the questions Isaac asked were very important, because I think what the project has done for me is kind of make me feel what it means to say perpetrator and victim are not clear-cut categories. So you can read about that in the literature, that people say, oh, these are not clear categories and they often overlap, but you don't really understand what it means until you actually start engaging with people. So yes, we did have people who you could call the perpetrators, so ex-combatants who in the war killed people, and probably also as a unit, at least, not every single person perhaps, killed civilians in that war. And we had people who had suffered a lot, so lost relatives or suffered themselves from the violent conflict. At the same time, these groups had, for example, a mother among the civilians and her daughter who was a combatant in the same room, right? Or you had kind of siblings in different armed groups during the conflict, depending on what the landscape of war was in the region where they were living at certain times and what strategies people used to not become victims of the war, but actually to take sides somehow. Or you could see that some people were telling us or embroidering how they joined the guerrilla because they had been victims of armed violence, for example, by the Colombian military or by paramilitary groups, right? So I think it kind of, what the embroideries show to me is that these categories don't seem to make that much sense, and people have actually a lot in common and see themselves as having a lot in common, but they take different decisions and trajectories during their life. But it also means they can still kind of talk to each other, and that was interesting to see. So there wasn't any, so for those people who took part in our workshops and activities, there was no aggression in that sense. And I mean, we were just and we were one project among many others. Colombia is probably at the moment the most overstudied country in the world, I suppose, with lots of academics descending upon it trying to do projects. But we were just one tiny project that invited people to participate in something. And we also didn't expect to have a massive impact on the peace process. Of course, if we were able to do a tiny little bit, fine, but there was A, no intention, and B, no misunderstanding that our tiny project could actually contribute to the peace process in that sense. So that wasn't the idea, but we hope, of course, that we haven't made things worse and rather contributed to more dialogue and more hope. And I think the same comes with the kind of the traumatic images. They were more conjured up in our interviews, so nobody embroidered something particularly traumatic, but people sometimes talked about traumatic events. But then kind of I feel like, so like my colleague Beatrice says, people in Colombia have endured so many things, and sometimes they want to talk about them actually, and it's kind of liberating to talk to somebody from the outside about these things. And we didn't ask around traumatic things if they wanted to talk about them. That was their choice. And we just had an event before where Beatrice was talking about this project, and I think she was kind of making a good point that one of the principles of our work was to care also by going back, by not just going and interviewing a person for like once and then never coming back and taking our data and disappearing, but going back and still being in contact with everyone on WhatsApp and on the phone and so on, even after the project, just as a kind of, as a form of kind of shared humanity, I suppose, that the project doesn't just end and then you drop people, but you actually have a responsibility towards them because you have shared something with each other. I can't remember whether there was anything else. Oh yeah, no, there was an important one with the memory work and the textile traditions in Latin America. Yes, of course. I mean, one of the reasons I think why textiles also work very well in Latin America is because there is this textile tradition. On the other hand, I don't think our project was so much about making memory. And I admire the work that a lot of groups are doing around memories and working with victims of violent conflict. But there's also a certain, I don't know, sometimes, so the processes we were looking at were ongoing processes and they're still ongoing, right? So they're about the here and now. It's not about putting things in the past. And sometimes what memory work does is it tries to put things in the past, and I don't think that was particularly our intention with this project. Catalina, your other question was also very interesting. So we did start out with these two communities, and projects are kind of limited in time and money and what you can do and so on. But we quite quickly realized after we had done that particular project that it's really important to also kind of go into see those connections with the urban areas and so on. The point I mentioned at the very beginning, that we didn't actually look at individual reincorporation processes of people who just are in different places and try to make a living there. And I think this continuation project that we are doing now does much more of that, and tries to make these connections and see how the war, although it might have been waged somewhere in the countryside, was also in the cities, not least due to displaced people and so on, kind of coming to the urban areas. So I think there's more in that project now than it was in the original version of it. It's an ongoing project. I mean, we're not stopping anytime soon, I think, and there's so much more to be learned.
Thank you, Berit. And I think that precisely shows that we start some journeys and we don't know where we end up. And that's the beauty of life. It continues flowing. And I hope that this dialogue has taken you to unexpected places, you, Berit, and all of the people who have attended today here. Surely has taken me to places that I didn't expect, like confuse my current affiliation with the University of Winchester with my previous study as a student at Sussex University. But there you go. Let me just clarify it, just to show the imperfection of the left brain, of the left hemisphere, that I was talking about my students at the University of Winchester who were studying the Masters in Reconciliation and Peace Building. But that said, Berit, I think and I hope that everyone here has really found this conversation fascinating. We have gone through, like in this stream, we have gone through very different places. We have touched upon collective memories, individual memories, personal journeys of forgiveness or not, the idea, the importance of grief and how people can cope to grief in different ways when they face different realities. We have listened to different elements of how textile making engage, as human beings in a different way from the other narrative techniques that we use. We have listened also, we have heard about the journey of members of the FARC in this process of meeting communities who had been affected by the armed struggle. For some people who are not Latin American or not Colombian, probably it has been a really enriching experience to get to understand the complexities of this journey in Colombia and opportunities that is open for other regions in the world. Because yes, it's true that human beings, are violent. Some of us, some of them, let's put it in a collective way, that there is war, but there is also so much potential for peace. And if something keeps us as a species going across the planet, is that capacity to move on from conflict to peace and back, and try to find strategies to understand how these things happen by doing really interesting research is one of the important things that we need to do, but also to put into practice new techniques to try to navigate these muddy waters between conflict and peace is what many people who work on peace building and reconciliation try to do. For me, I've been keep thinking all the time about this new book that I've been reading by Ian McGilchrist on the division in the brain between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and all his call to try to embrace the world through the right hemisphere. And I think that's precisely what your project has been doing, engage with a more contemplative approach to life that cannot be narrowed to words or to language, but existence is far more richer than what we can reduce to our narratives and stories that we tell ourselves. And by engaging with reality in a different way, I think you are opening a new window of opportunity that cannot be grasped by the way how we have been talking about. The second thing that I've been thinking, and it's in my mind, and hopefully continues to be in the mind of some of the people here, was when you mentioned John Paul Lederach, and how through using these techniques you are using creativity, because and I think that's beautiful when we think about the approach of John Paul Lederach, who moves away from a liberal technocratic approach of peace building that you can measure, that you can put into a log frame, that you can plan. Is that what he says is that peace building is like the art and soul of changing and creating new relationships between human beings that have been trapped in conflict. And so, of course, art is such an important part of creativity and to finding new ways forward. So hopefully, with this, for some of you who have been thinking a lot about reconciliation, who have been trying to look for experiences of reconciliation in other places, who wanted to hear about the experience of members of the FARC with a project that was using an alternative technique to try to collect this and to think about it, but also to have an impact in the concrete reality in which they were intervening, you have found this an enriching experience, and you have built something new with us together, and you find useful to connect with people across the world to think together about a different subject. So I would like to invite you all, if you want, to turn your microphones on and to turn your cameras on if you can, and give a round of applause to Berit and to all of you who have contributed to this beautiful space today here with Rodemos el Diálogo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see how